Well, hello, my name is John Waller. I'm sitting here with Dr. Marcus Ross. He's a geologist, a paleontologist, and just an all-around experienced educator and researcher. And he represents the Cornerstone Educational Supply. Be sure to check him out online. And we're just going to pick his brain about how the Christian faith remains credible in academia or not. You know, that's a big issue these days, whether or not Christianity can still hold its credibility in the academic context. So some would say, if you're a Christian, you can't be serious about academics. Others might say, if you're serious about academics, you can't possibly be serious about being a Christian. So what say you? I know you have definitely a lot of experience in both. Yeah. And I would love to hear your thoughts about this. And maybe something you would have to share with parents of students who are growing up, looking at college, and what lies ahead, and where do you see academia going at this point?
Yeah, and that's a lot of questions in there. There's a lot for us to go through and talk about on this. So I guess, kind of by way of introduction, so people know, where I'm coming from in this realm of academia. My initial educational experience, my K through 12, was all public school. I grew up in Rhode Island and went to public school my whole life. After undergrad, or after going to 12th grade, I went to Penn State University for my undergraduate. So I was fleeing the state of Rhode Island at age 18, trying to get someplace else to study geology. I loved dinosaurs and fossils, and I wanted to be a paleontologist. So I went to Penn State. So, it was a state school and a big one at that, go Nittany Lions. And absolutely loved my experience there. It wasn't always easy. College isn't supposed to be, but, there's all those coming of age sort of issues that come along with that. And from there, I went on for a master's degree at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, which is way out in Rapid City, South Dakota, not far from the Mount Rushmore monument. And there I was studying vertebrate paleontology. So I was getting really deep in the weeds in, what I had always wanted to do as a kid. I was becoming a paleontologist for real, out there. And it took me a while to finish off my degree. There were some problems at the school, not just with me, but with the program. And that will come back into play about, some of the conflicts that we might run into with Christianity. Then after that, I went over to my home state of Rhode Island, never expected to go back, and began work on a Ph.D. in the geosciences, again with paleontology, and finished that off in 2016. So when I think about, can a Christian be in academia? Well, I certainly was for a long time, K through PhD, all of it in state schools. I never went to even a private non-Christian school or a private Christian school. Everything that I went to was a state school until I started teaching at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. That's where I went from Rhode Island. It's where I wanted to go. I wanted to work at a Christian environment because I had some different views about evolution than what I was taught, and I needed a place where I would have the freedom to engage in that kind of research without fear of retaliation or other sorts of problems. So I was a university professor for 16 years at Liberty University, and I just stepped down from teaching to work full-time with the company my wife and I started, Cornerstone Educational Supply. So it kind of took off, and we're kind of like, all right, well, I can only do so many jobs at once and, still be dad and, engage in some of the other academic research that I wanted to do. So, but, that's, 12 years in K through 12, another 12 years worth of undergraduate through PhD, and 16 years worth of teaching at the university level. I love academics. And I really loved being in academia. I didn't leave because I was worn out, burnt out, bitter, or anything like that. I left just because I needed to pick and choose what sort of job was going to be how we ran the family. And I'm still an adjunct at the school, so I still am going to get to teach, which I really love to do. I'm still be teaching earth science classes, and I'm engaged in research with colleagues there. So when I think about, can a Christian be in academia? Yeah, they absolutely can, and they can love it, and they can thrive, depending on what particular path they're after. And that might land them at a Christian school like it did for me. It might land them at a community college or a private secular school or a state school. It could end up in a lot of different areas. You could end up in a research lab, not doing any teaching. There are all sorts of different ways that people can be engaged in academics, from the teaching to the support to the administrative side of things. And we need Christians involved in all of that, in all those different places. We need Christians not just at Christian schools, but at public schools as well. When Jesus told us, to go out into all the world, he was the guy who kind of went into some of the seamier parts of the world. When we think about what the Pharisees accused Jesus of hanging out with drunkards and tax collectors and, these sorts of folks, Jesus didn't seem to be altogether bothered by going into places that religious people generally didn't like to go, and for understandable reasons. Like the drunkards, the tax collectors, these were people who, generally speaking, weren't honest, good, nice people. But Jesus's message needed to go to them, as he told the Pharisees, even more so, right? That those who are sick need this message. Those who are healthy, you guys are kind of okay here at the moment. So when I think about, what's our role as Christians, our role is to do whatever it is, first off, that God lays on our heart to do. And sometimes what God lays in front of our heart is a range of options too, right? I'm not going to say that everybody's got one particular path, because I don't see God working quite that way. But at least for me, he took a kid who, fell in love with dinosaurs at age 4. I mean, I was that kid. I was that nerdy little kid who just, I was dinosaurs all the time. And into high school, there was still dinosaurs. And you're like, shouldn't you be into other things by now? And I'm like, no. So he took, this little kid who had this passion for paleontology and fossils and geology, and allowed me to run with that. I think, knowing that, certainly as God, knowing that there's going to be troubles, there's going to be trials, there's going to be difficulties along this way. But that if I maintained my walk with him, if I maintained close connections to my churches on through that, if I had a good, prayer life, those would be the sorts of things that would help get me through areas where there would be difficulties. And there certainly were a lot of difficulties that I ran into. The main reason for my difficulties is because I believed that God actually created the world as more or less outlined in Genesis, that it was 6 days, a few thousands of years ago. And as you can imagine, everything about that origins account in Genesis runs contrary to the typical way that people understand the origin of the universe through the Big Bang, the cosmic construction of the Earth, the moon, the planets, the sun, etc., what's called the nebular hypothesis, and the evolutionary development of life over time. Stands in very sharp contrast. Now, some Christians seek to find a way of understanding both at the same time. Personally, I still don't see that as an option. But so it meant that everything that I was learning was different from what I actually believed. And for some people, they were okay with that. They could kind of look at that and say, well, yeah, you can kind of look at evolution as a mental exercise, and you can operate in this kind of this realm, this puzzle, this world, even though you don't agree with it. And I found actually that my colleagues in philosophy understood that far better than my colleagues in science did. And it's because philosophers are used to entertaining somebody's idea and running with it and seeing how far it gets you. And if it gets you into someplace crazy, then you walk back and you're like, I guess we can't go there. Whereas scientists tend to have this more linear view that truth can only be attained through certain ways of experimentation, observation, standard scientific method, with a fundamental assumption that nature is all there is and all we can use to do any of our explaining in science, both in the modern and also in the deep past. So philosophers are a little bit more willing to entertain wild possibilities, even if they disagree with them. And I know some folks who even wrote dissertations based on this would be the way truth works out if this person's idea and concepts are correct. And as a philosopher, they didn't even have to buy into that to go through that. And in a similar kind of way, I was doing that with evolutionary science, that if evolutionary science was correct, these are the sorts of things that would pan out in the groups of animals that I was studying, for example, for my Ph.D. The fact that I disagreed with some of those foundational assumptions about naturalism, for example, about the age of the earth, et cetera, meant that some of the folks that I came into contact in academia, fought hard against that, sought to punish me in various ways, even throw me out of my master's program. And other external forces came against me in my Ph.D. work. But, one of the things that I found is that if I told my advisors ahead of time that I was a young earth creationist and let them know, and they had the opportunity to let that sink in and either decide to keep me on or, see if they could pass me off to somebody else. If they did keep me on, then they kept me on knowing full well, what I was and what I was presenting. Even though I was acting like a standard evolutionary scientist in the classes and my writings for, research and things like that, they at least kind of knew where I stood. And so when some of these other external problems came out from other people who were just trying to cause me trouble, they could say, yes, thank you. We do know who he is. And yes, we do know that about him. Thank you for your concerns. Now you can go, dunk your head in a lake. And it was really neat to be able to see people who didn't agree with me in academia about these topics being willing to step up and say, yeah, but he's one of ours and he's doing good work. And so you folks from outside have nothing to bring here. There's no accusations that you can bring. And I think, that's one of those strategies that I had as someone who is so very different from the rest of my colleagues in academia in an environment of paleontology where all these different viewpoints are clashing. Biological evolution, age of the earth, all those sorts of things that are unescapable. It's just, there's no way to avoid those problems that you can do sometimes in other disciplines. But by letting people know ahead of time about that, it was a way of, first off, being risky, which wasn't fun. It was not easy to walk into somebody's office and say, okay, I got to tell you now that I'm here, I'm a young earth creationist. And some of them said, oh yeah, we already knew that. One of your advisors told us about that. We know, whatever. And others, on the other hand, who were like, oh, we thought you were a creationist and that was just your religious thing, but you actually really believe it with science. Oh, you've got to go. We got to get rid of you. And we'll do everything in our power, including some really squirrely math to see if we can do that. But in that, as a Christian, the fact that somebody's attacking you doesn't mean that you get to hang up your Christianity and just fight back because you want to. And it would be nice. It would be kind of fun. It might be cathartic to say, well, I'm going to bring a lawsuit against you guys. I'm going to sue you for everything you're worth, and all these sorts of things. And you kind of hope that doesn't crop up. But your witness is being tested in all that. How are you going to return evil for evil? It's not what we're supposed to do. You get slapped in the face and you're supposed to turn the other cheek, particularly when it is for your Christian faith. Right? This isn't, a situation where you did bad work and you're getting punished and you got to take your lumps because, you just weren't a good student. You're going to get washed out. Here it was, at least in South Dakota, it was very specifically because of my stance outside of the class in these other things. But there were a lot of people watching. There's other graduate students, there's other faculty, there are your friends, there's people in your church. And what I thought was amazing at that time was seeing people in the church rise up to help a brother who was wounded. So, going through a course like I did in academia was a tricky one. It was really difficult. At the same time, I have to also keep it in perspective. If I was kicked out of grad school because of my faith, I was kicked out of grad school. It's not a big deal. I happen to live in America. I'm not being persecuted for my faith in a way where I'm going to be drawn and quartered. We're not talking about Nero's courtyard, Christians dipped in wax and set alight. I mean, so somebody makes fun of me on Twitter. Exactly. Got to let that roll off my back. So there's the temptation to fight. There's the temptation for despair, which for a personality like mine, a little bit more melancholic, the tendency to despair is the other side, where you abandon the idea that God can help, and that man has triumphed, and you get a little, maybe a little Jeremiah on everybody for it. But at the same time, no, God's resources are infinite, and he's able to bring people through it. So that's a long, run through to kind of get where I was. And after that, teaching at a Christian school where I was academically safe to explore creationist perspectives. But that didn't mean that I was safe entirely. I would go to national meetings for geology, and people on more than one occasion would point out in front of a whole big crowd that I was a young earth creationist. And this was the defeater to whatever it was that I said that didn't have anything to do with creation. So you run into that, and you get, mockery and those sorts of things. You go on the line, you look up my name. It's not pretty. And I don't try and clean up my social presence online. There's people out there that just apparently are professional jerks, and apparently are very good at their job. Yeah.
Let me ask real quick on that note before you get farther down. Was there ever a time, was there something along the way that somebody did say that kind of shook you, that shook your faith, and you're like, wait, maybe I am wrong? Or like, can you think of a time where that did happen and you're like, you started rethinking some of this Christian stuff, some of the Bible stuff, and you thought maybe these guys were right? Like, has that ever happened, or was it always just, you were able to brush it off?
Oh yeah. I was always cool as a cucumber. No, there have been serious challenges. When you get into graduate school, you start getting really focused on a particular discipline, right? So I learned geology as an undergraduate, and then my master's degree is in vertebrate paleontology. I mean, a tiny subset of all the fields of geology. And in that, I started to learn in greater detail the arguments for an ancient age of the Earth, things like radioactive dating methods, the particular layering of the geological record, right? If you go up to the Smithsonian and you go visit the new Hall of Dinosaurs that they have, you're going to learn about all the names like Jurassic and Cretaceous and things like that. I learned the subsystems of that and the subsystems of those. And you find that there's these, really kind of well-distinguished layers. And that, to this day, is a difficulty for me to understand as someone who thinks that Noah's flood is largely responsible for these different layers. How do you get such precise distinctions between the different fossils that are found in one unit of rock below a different unit of rock that's got different fossils? And there were plenty of times where I'm staring at the textbook, or I'm staring at the collection tray in front of me, and wondering, how on earth does this make any sense? And sometimes I've ended up with answers for those, and sometimes I haven't. I don't think that we can get it all figured out. And I don't say that as a defeatist way. Part of that is the excitement for me as a scientist is that there's lots of stuff we don't know. And that means there's lots of things that are still out there to know. We teach science a lot of times as if everything's been discovered, all the laws of nature, all forces and things like that. But every time you hit a hammer against a rock, there's a possibility that there's something new. And even if it's a species that everybody knows, it's the first time this thing has ever been seen by human eyes. And that's kind of it's kind of fun. It's kind of neat. That's what animates a lot of my colleagues in paleontology, is just this thing. So yeah, there have definitely been those sorts of troubles and problems on the evidential side. Having to deal with evolutionary theory all the time in paleontology, reading people like Richard Dawkins, reading other noted evolutionists, Richard Lawton, reading in anthropology articles in journals about evolution of man or things like that, a project that I'm involved in at the moment. There are some pretty serious challenges to the Christian faith that crop up. There was that one professor at Penn State. I didn't take him, but it was known as the guy who really did say, if those of you who are Christians, raise your hands. By the end of this class, you either won't be in this class or you won't be Christians. And that was back in the 90s. So if we think that things are challenging for students today, they were challenging back then. You had very aggressive folks at that time who were very militant, for example, in their atheism. That they were going to show and prove that to these Christians that you didn't belong here. Your question, can you be a Christian in academia? They would say no. You can't do it, and I'll show you why. and I'll take your faith from you while you're at it. Notches on the doorpost for them. And so I avoided some of those folks, and I was blessed by having a good number of people who weren't so militant, even though they disagreed. They figured, we'll just let him learn some more. He'll eventually come to the right conclusions. They're right conclusions, if you will. But yeah, thinking about being on a big state campus like Penn State, like I did, or UVA, or JMU, or something like that, you never know where you end up finding some interesting allies. And you find that there are Christians in most all of the departments somewhere, not everywhere. When I was at the University of Rhode Island, I don't think any of the geology faculty were Christians. A couple of the grad students were, though, right? And it wasn't just me. I wasn't the lone Elijah, Isaiah. It's just me, Lord. And no, there's more out there. And graduate school is the time for an academic, really, where you start to build your core groups of friends and relationships, people who are going to be your colleagues for a long time. And I had friends from other aspects of the university. So, I was in a particularly Christian light zone of academics. The biological sciences, there's not as many. Certainly in the social sciences, psychology can be kind of tough. But in places like chemistry, places like engineering, sometimes physics, even in those areas that are sciences or very closely attached to the sciences, mathematical stuff, you would find Christians, and sometimes very stout Christians in those places. And everybody knew it. And, they might even be the faculty advisor for your local InterVarsity fellowship or Campus Crusade for Christ, or, whatever. And those were people that, you could talk to. And sometimes it's hard to get out of your bubble and your friends and everybody talks the same language. We're all talking fossils and rocks and stuff. But don't be afraid if you're on campus to go over to one of those Christian fellowships. You need to band together in a culture right now where Christians have very much been outflanked and now largely outnumbered from a lot of these positions.